Hello, welcome to another episode of Kopi-O with CISO podcast. It's been a long time since I recorded an episode, but with this new development, I just couldn't resist the temptation. So today, I'm flying solo to unpack the latest from Bank Negara Malaysia. On the 7th of November 2024, BNM released an exposure draft on risk management in technology, or RMiT ED. We'll just call it the ED. Now, this ED casts a wide net, covering everyone from big banks to those nifty money operators we all rely on. If you are listening, yes, this could directly impact you. So let's break it down and figure out what this really means. Now, this ED, it's aimed at like all sorts of financial institutions compared to the current in effect version of RMIT, which was issued in June 2023. In that version, where only 8 types of FIs were included, the ED will include additional 2 types of entities. There are non-bank merchant acquirers and intermediary remittance institutions. But what's really interesting is that these could actually directly impact you, the listener. So I'm going to break down this ED today and figure out what it all means. And also, what's really striking to me is the timing of this document. We have seen so many like high profile cybersecurity incidents across the globe lately, and also financial frauds and scams locally, right? So this feels like BNM is taking a proactive step here to strengthen those defenses for the whole financial system. It's like they're saying, okay, the landscape is changing, threats are evolving, we need to up our game. And how things are done usually by BNM that follows the route of public consultation. The ED is open for feedback until the 31st of January 2025. So getting input from the FIs that will actually be impacted by this can make sure that those final regulations are practical, right? And that they are effective. It's not like BNM is dictating things from the top. So it's a collaborative approach how things are done normally, right? So who are we talking about here? Who's affected? It's a pretty wide net, like everyone from the likes of licensed banks, investment banks, Islamic banks, insurance companies, and even those financial technology players like e-money issuers and payment system operators, right? So they are really casting a wide net. It's almost like BNM is saying, yeah, look, technology is woven into the fabric of finance these days, and everybody needs to step up. But what does stepping up actually entail in this case? Well, BNM has laid out 3 main objectives, at least the way I look at the ED. The first is to make the financial system more resilient. You can think about it like earthquake proofing of buildings, and the analogy goes with cyber attacks and technology failures becoming more and more frequent, right? So BNM wants to make sure that these institutions can withstand these shocks. You don't want your FI to crumble if their systems go down, right? The second objective is all about customer protection. BNM is really emphasizing safeguards against things like digital fraud, financial fraud, right? So they want people to feel confident and secure when they are using financial services, especially online. That's huge, right? So especially with digital fraud on the rise in Malaysia and doesn't look like slowing down anytime soon, right? So they are focusing on really building trust, right? Making the system more reliable. And the third objective is this, is about the future. BNM wants to facilitate the secure adoption of technology advancements, right? So they are recognizing the need for innovation. Innovation is key, but they want to make sure that it's implemented securely and responsibly. So we've got these three big goals: resilience, customer protection, and responsible innovation. But what does this actually mean for these financial institutions? What are they expected to do? The draft goes deep into specific requirements, starting with establishing a really robust technology risk management framework. It's not just about being careful, it's about having clear processes, strong leadership, a well-trained technology and cyber risk workforce, if you will, right? So it's really about building a solid foundation. So the ED maintains the mandate to appoint a chief information security officer, or a CISO, and this person needs to be empowered to lead the charge. The ED also stresses the importance of skilled personnel and ongoing training to keep up with that constantly evolving threat landscape. So it's a matter of, you can't just set it and forget it, right? So technology risk management is an ongoing process, right? So now let's get into some of the operational specifics here. The draft covers a lot of ground, right? But I think the technology project management section is particularly important. So why is that? So because so much of the risk stems from how these technology projects are planned and executed, right? So the draft calls for stringent governance and risk assessment requirements, especially for projects involving critical systems. So, like, imagine building a digital skyscraper on a shaky foundation. That's a recipe for disaster, right? So, BNM is saying, take your time, plan carefully, and make sure you have the right people and resources in place before you start building, right? Now, what about system development and acquisition, right? So, that is another area that's ripe for risk. And the ED also addresses this head on. So they are pushing for secure software development lifecycle, which is a fancy way of saying build software securely from the ground up, right? So they also talk about mitigating shadow IT risks, managing security patches effectively, even thinking about the cybersecurity of your suppliers, your whole supply chain. um, you know can be like a chain reaction if the cybersecurity risk stems from supply chain, your suppliers, right? So it's like one weak link can bring down your services, if not the whole system. Then there is this whole section of cryptography, which always intimidates me. It always sounds very technical, but it's crucial. Think of cryptography is the foundation of secure communication and data storage. It's about making sure that even if someone intercepts your data, right, they can't actually read it without the right keys. And BNM wants to make sure that financial institutions have robust policies and practices in place for managing those keys securely. Um, you know we have talked about securing data, like in transit and at rest, but what about the physical security of data centers, right? So similar to the current policy document, the ED is really specific about data center resilience. They call for redundant capacity, meaning backup systems in case the primary one fails, physical security to prevent unauthorized access, and they even suggest avoiding disaster prone areas for those data center locations. You don't want to build your data center in a flood prone area, right? Next is having a robust incident response plan, which is key. What happens if a disaster does strike, right? So BNM wants these institutions to be prepared. They are also really specific about service availability. They set maximum allowable downtime limits for essential services like debit card processing or ATM transaction. This is similar to the current policy document. Disruptions from these technology failures or cyber incidents should not exceed 4 hours in a rolling 12-month period with a maximum tolerable downtime of 120 minutes per incident, right? So that's a tight window, similar to the current requirements, like I mentioned. The emphasis here is really on reliability and minimizing disruption. And this meticulousness is even more apparent when we look at network resilience. The ED outlines specific design and security requirements for network infrastructure, right? So they stress the importance of network segmentation. What exactly is network segmentation? It's a security strategy that involves dividing your network into smaller, isolated segments. Think of it like dividing your house into separate rooms with locked doors, right? So if someone breaks into one room, they can't easily get to the rest of the house. So even if one part of the network is compromised, the damage is contained. And the ED also highlights the importance of network device logs, basically keeping detailed records of activity for investigations and forensic purposes. It's like having security cameras that record everything that happens on that network, right? Next, um, what about backups, right? So everyone knows those are important, right? So the ED calls for secure backup procedures, offsite storage, and even recommends testing these processes periodically, kind of like a fire drill but for data recovery. So what the ED wants is for the FIs to make sure their backups are actually working. They're not just sitting on a shelf gathering dust or sitting somewhere that not knowing whether it will work when you need it to work, right? Here's also something else that's interesting. They also talk about the need for tamper-proof backups, specifically to address destructive cyber attacks like ransomware. So it is obvious that BNM is taking this threat very seriously. And having tamper-proof backups means that even if hackers or malicious actors encrypt your primary data, you have got a clean, untouched copy that you can restore from without paying the ransom, right? So it's a way to avoid giving in to those demands. So I'm starting to see a pattern here. Be prepared, have a plan, test your plan, and have backups for your backups, right? So moving on, this theme of meticulousness continues when we look at third-party service provider management section, right? So financial institutions rely on external companies for a lot of technology-related services, and that creates potential vulnerabilities. So the ED emphasizes the importance of due diligence on these providers. Is not just enough to just trust them, right? So you have to verify that their security practices are up to par. The ED also calls for clear service level agreements, the SLAs, that outline things like disaster recovery capabilities and exit strategies. So it's about managing that whole ecosystem, not just your internal system. Now, let's move on, right? So what about cloud services? This is becoming more and more popular, right? So BNM did update the existing policy document with regard to cloud-related risk management when they updated it in June 2023. We know that cloud services are becoming increasingly popular within the financial sector, with many cloud service providers are setting up their shops in Malaysia, but they come with their own set of risks. So BNM requires a comprehensive risk assessment before adopting cloud services, especially for critical systems. And they also highlight specific risks like data location, multi-tenancy, and vendor lock-in, right? So they are basically saying that cloud is great, but proceed with caution. Moving on to access control, that seems like a pretty fundamental aspect of cybersecurity. I'm a strong proponent of identity-based security, and BNM goes into a lot of detail here, and this is expected as the threat landscape has almost totally shifted to become identity-based. So the ED stresses the need for strict policies like emphasizing things like least privilege and time-bound access. They also talk about robust authentication methods and regular monitoring of access logs. It's about controlling who has access to what data and for how long, right? So we have covered a lot of grounds here, but it feels like I've only just scratched the surface of cybersecurity. Let's recap, right? So I was talking about the nuts and bolts of BNM's approach, everything from data centers to cloud security. But now I think it's time to tackle the big one, cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is really woven throughout this entire exposure draft document. It's clear that BNM continues to see it as like the cornerstone of a resilient and trustworthy financial system, right? So, how does BNM approach cybersecurity in this draft? Well, they are pushing for what they call a cyber resilience framework, CRF. This is also in the current version of the policy document. It maintains the same stance with the current requirements, right? So CRF is essentially a blueprint for building an organization that can withstand cyber attacks, but also bounce back quickly and effectively. So the ED is literally saying, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. So and no system is foolproof, right? So the ED really emphasizes the importance of knowing your weaknesses. They want FIs to understand their own cyber risk profile and like what are their vulnerabilities, what are the most likely attack vectors, what are their crown jewels, and that they absolutely need to protect. So it starts with self-awareness, knowing your vulnerability. Then it's about building robust cybersecurity controls, the technical and procedural safeguards that make up your defenses. Some example things like firewalls, intrusion detection systems, strong passwords, multi-factor authentication, all those tools in the cybersecurity arsenal. If you have been long enough in this space, all these will sound like a constant arms race with the bad guys, right? So as soon as you build a wall, they figure out a way to climb over it. And that's why the ED stresses the need for proactive threat intelligence gathering, right? So you got to keep your finger on the pulse, right? So of the latest threats, understand how those attackers are operating and adapt your defenses constantly, continuously. You can't just sit back and wait for them to come to you. And one of the most interesting parts of BNM's approach, I think, is their emphasis on testing. So they specifically recommend red team simulation exercises. Imagine bringing in a team of ethical hackers to try to break into your systems. It's a control attacks that help you identify vulnerabilities before the real bad guys find them, right? Another analogy is it's like a stress test, but for your cybersecurity. So you are deliberately putting those systems under pressure to see where those weak points are. And the ED also calls for detailed cyber incidents response plans, CIRP, and they even recommend annual cyber drill exercises to test those plans. So it's not just about building defenses, it's about knowing what to do when those defenses are breached. It is, about what happens when the alarm bells start ringing, right? So you need to be able to contain that damage, respond and recover quickly, and learn from that experience. Basically, they are saying cybersecurity isn't just the IT department's problem, it's everyone's responsibility. That's the key takeaway. Everyone in the organization, in the financial institutions, needs to be aware of those risks and understand their role in navigating them. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about digital fraud, which is a whole new thing in the ED, right? So this seems to be a major concern for BNM, rightly so, given the rampant financial frauds and scams in tandem with the rise of digital financial services, right? So it makes sense as more and more transactions move online. The opportunities for fraud, um, they just increase exponentially. It's not just about protecting financial institutions, it's about protecting customers, right? So we have all heard those stories about people falling, victim to scams of, or having their money being stolen. It can be devastating. So BNM is emphasizing a multi-layered approach to fraud prevention. They are calling for things like robust customer authentication, continuous fraud monitoring and detection, and even empowering customers to manage their own security testings. So it's clear that BNM is upping the game by saying, we are going to do everything we can to protect you, but you also need to be an active participant in your own security, right? So they are also stressing the importance of customer awareness programs, education, right? So educating people about those risks, and how to protect themselves. Well, knowledge is power, right? So, what about when things go wrong? What happens if someone suspects they've been a victim of fraud? Well, the ED calls for convenient fraud reporting mechanisms. They want to make it as easy as possible for people to report suspected fraud, and they're also outlining measures to protect those customers in case of data breaches, right? So it's about having a safety net, right? So knowing that there are procedures in place to help you, if you become a victim. Now, all of these requirements, they sound great in theory, but how does BNM plan to ensure that FIs are actually following them, implementing them, right? So that's where audits and assurance come in. The ED calls for regular technology audits, is similar with the current policy document, right? So both internal and external, to ensure ongoing compliance. It's about accountability and transparency, right? So it's like having a building inspector coming in and making sure that everything is sound, safe, and secure, right? So, and BNM is actually going a step further by requiring institutions to conduct specific assessments on their data centers and networks using external service providers, bringing in outside experts to provide that objective assessment or evaluation. Now, we have talked a lot about present day risk, right? So, what about the future? How does this ED address the rapidly evolving landscape of technology and finance. So we can see that BNM is looking ahead, anticipating the challenges and opportunities presented by emerging technologies and trying to strike balance between fostering innovation and managing risk. So this ED isn't just about today's risk, right? It's about preparing the financial sector for what's coming next. And BNM seems to be taking a very forward-looking approach here. So they are not just trying to play catch up, right? So they are trying to anticipate the next move. So talking about next move or the future, what kind of future focused guidance or requirements are we really talking about here, right? So, well, the ED really emphasizes the need for FIs to stay ahead of the curve when it comes to these new technologies, but to carefully assess the risks associated with them. It's about finding that sweet spot between innovation and security. You don't want to stifle innovation, right? So let's take quantum computing as an example. Imagine a world where financial algorithms are making split second trading decisions based on AI, or where quantum computers could crack the encryption that protects our most sensitive data. That's both exciting and a little unnerving, right? So how does BNM expect institutions to manage these risks? Well, the ED provides guidance on assessing and managing risks associated with these new technologies. And they really stress the importance of continuous monitoring and adaptation. They encourage FIs to have those clear policies and procedures in place, conduct thorough risk assessments, and just stay informed about the latest developments in the tech world. So it's like saying they are, it's like they are saying, go ahead and explore, but keep your eyes open and be prepared to adjust costs if needed. So BNM recognizes that the future of finance is really linked to technology, and they are trying to create a regulatory environment that fosters both innovation and security. So we have covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. What are some key takeaways for the listeners? Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that BNM is sending a clear message. Cybersecurity and technology risk management, they are not just technical issues anymore, right? So they are board level concerns that demand that strategic attention. They are saying this is everyone's responsibility, from the top board, CEO, down to the frontline staff. I think for the average person listening, it really underscores the importance of being aware of those risks, taking steps to protect yourself online, and choosing financial institutions that prioritize security. Now, this exposure draft is still open for feedback, as I mentioned earlier. So, if you have thoughts or concerns, make your voice heard. It's a conversation that affects us all, right? So, all right, that wraps up this deep dive into Bank Negara Malaysia's risk management in technology exposure draft, and I hope you found it insightful and informative. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, stay secure.